Hey guys, tonight we step into the story of a man who began as a tough kid on the streets of Brooklyn and ended up as one of the longest reigning bosses in Mafia history. He wasn't a loud figure flashing wealth or chasing headlines. He was patient, calculating, and always a step ahead. We're talking about Carmine the Snake Persico, the man who led the Colombo crime family for more than 3 decades, even from inside a prison cell. Picture this. It's the 1960s in New York City. The 5 families hold power over construction sites, labor unions, and neighborhoods where whispers carried more weight than laws. While others fought openly for attention, Persico mastered survival in the shadows. He was clever, unpredictable, and somehow always managed to slip past the traps set for him. That's how he earned his nickname, because like a snake, he could strike without warning and disappear just as quickly. But this isn't just the story of a mafia boss. It's about endurance, control, and the price of never letting go of power. It's about how one man outlasted rivals, government crackdowns, and even his own imprisonment, holding on to his throne longer than almost anyone else in mob history. So before we begin, hit that like button if you enjoy these late-night mob tales, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and follow me into the world of Carmine Persico, a world where silence was strength, patience was power, and leadership lasted a lifetime. The story of Carmine Persico begins in Brooklyn, New York in the year 1933, when the Great Depression still had its grip on America. The Persico family, like many others, lived a modest life. They were Italian immigrants, trying to find their place in a country that offered opportunities but also harsh struggles. Carmine grew up in Carroll Gardens, a neighborhood that at the time was a mix of working-class families, corner shops, and a rough street life that pulled young men toward gangs. He was the third of 5 children, and although his family hoped for him to follow an honest path, Carmine's sharp mind and restless spirit would eventually push him toward something much larger. As a child, Carmine wasn't unlike many other boys in the neighborhood. He played stickball in the streets, ran errands for his parents, and tried to help when he could. But beneath the ordinary appearance, there was an intensity about him. He wasn't just another kid. Even in school, teachers noticed that he had quick wit and sharp instincts. He could talk himself out of trouble with a charm that made him seem older than he was. But he also had a streak of rebellion that refused to bend to authority. That combination, charm and defiance, would follow him for the rest of his life. By his teenage years, Brooklyn was full of temptations for a boy like Carmine. The streets were alive with groups of young men who formed neighborhood gangs. For them, loyalty and reputation were everything. If you could fight, if you could stand your ground, and if you showed courage, you earned respect. Carmine didn't take long to prove himself. By the time he was 15, he was already running with a local gang called the Garfield Boys. These weren't the highly organized mafia families yet, but they were the proving grounds where young men learned how to navigate loyalty, violence, and opportunity. It was during this time that Carmine's reputation began to take shape. He was smaller than some of the other boys, but what he lacked in size he made up for in cleverness and ferocity. He wasn't afraid to stand up to older kids, and he developed a knack for strategy even in street fights. Instead of charging head-on, Carmine often found ways to turn situations to his advantage. His gang quickly noticed that he wasn't just another soldier. He was a thinker, someone who could guide others and come out on top. One story that floated around the neighborhood was about a fight Carmine had with a much bigger boy. Instead of trying to overpower him, Carmine found a way to outmaneuver him, striking quickly and retreating until he wore him down. By the end, the bigger boy admitted defeat, and Carmine walked away with more respect than ever. From that day forward, the nickname the Snake began to stick. Some said it was because of the way he struck swiftly and unpredictably, while others said it was because of his ability to slip out of dangerous situations unharmed. Either way, the name would follow him all his life. But Carmine wasn't just about fighting. He was also ambitious. He could see that the small-time gang life wasn't enough. He wanted more. Around this time, he started making connections with older men in the neighborhood who were tied to the Mafia, though Carmine may not have fully realized it at first. Brooklyn in the 1940s and 1950s was a stronghold for organized crime. Men like Joseph Profaci, an early boss who controlled what would later become the Colombo family, had their influence spread across Brooklyn's neighborhoods. Profaci's men controlled businesses, unions, and the streets in ways that ordinary people didn't always see, but the young men in gangs certainly noticed. Carmine's early encounters with these men left a strong impression on him. They carried themselves with confidence, dressed well, and always seemed to have money in their pockets. More importantly, they commanded respect wherever they went. Carmine, still just a teenager, understood that respect meant everything. He wanted that respect not just from the kids on the block but from the powerful men who ran the neighborhoods. It wasn't long before Carmine's gang activities caught the attention of these older figures. They saw in him something more than a reckless street kid. He had leadership, loyalty, and intelligence, all traits that the Mafia valued. At 16, Carmine was already beginning to serve as a runner for men connected to Profaci's family. He would carry messages, collect small payments, and deliver envelopes. These may have seemed like simple tasks, but for Carmine, they were steps into a much larger world. At home, his parents worried about the direction he was heading. His father, a man who worked hard to provide, hoped Carmine would focus on honest labor. His mother, too, feared that the company he was keeping would only bring trouble. But Carmine was determined. He had seen what a life of hard work brought: long hours, little reward, and endless struggle. He wanted more than that. He wanted to be somebody. As the 1950s unfolded, Carmine's life began to shift more deeply toward the Mafia. By his late teens, he was no longer just a neighborhood tough kid. He was becoming a known figure in Brooklyn. The older mobsters began to test him with bigger responsibilities. He collected larger sums of money, helped mediate disputes between younger gang members, and occasionally enforced orders. He was learning the codes of silence and loyalty that defined the Mafia world. But Carmine also had a natural instinct for survival. Unlike many young men who sought attention through reckless acts, Carmine was careful. He understood that real power didn't come from shouting or showing off. It came from patience, strategy, and earning the trust of those above you. He studied how the older men operated, how they made decisions, and how they balanced fear with respect. Slowly, he shaped himself in their image. By his early 20s, Carmine Persico was firmly on the radar of the Profaci family. He had earned the trust of men who saw his potential, and he was beginning to be pulled into conflicts that would shape the rest of his life. The Mafia world in New York was never stable for long. Rivalries brewed, alliances shifted, and even within families, battles for control simmered beneath the surface. Carmine was stepping into a life where loyalty could mean survival, but betrayal could mean the end. In these early years, Carmine's story was still just beginning. He was a young man from Brooklyn with a sharp mind, a dangerous reputation, and a hunger for respect. But the world he was entering was far bigger than the streets of Carroll Gardens. It was a world where fortunes were made and lost in whispers, where power was measured in silence, and where the choices of a single man could echo for decades. For Carmine Persico, the path forward was clear. The boy who once ran with the Garfield boys was now moving toward something greater. He was stepping into the shadowy realm of the Mafia, a world where every move mattered, and where his nickname, the Snake, would prove more fitting than anyone could have imagined. Carmine Persico's rise through the streets of Brooklyn during the 1950s was not an overnight transformation, but a slow, deliberate climb. Each year brought new responsibilities, new connections, and new lessons in the world of organized crime. By the time he was in his early 20s, Carmine had already earned a reputation that spread far beyond Carroll Gardens. He wasn't just another street fighter anymore. He was known as a young man with sharp instincts, someone who could be trusted to handle sensitive matters without drawing unnecessary attention. The Profaci crime family, one of the 5 families of New York, was the structure he was gravitating toward. Joseph Profaci himself was a man who mixed religion with power, always presenting himself as a pious Catholic while simultaneously building a criminal empire. His family controlled large portions of Brooklyn and Queens, with influence in unions, the garment industry, and even the docks. To young men like Carmine, aligning with Profaci's organization meant access to a wider network and opportunities that the small neighborhood gangs could never provide. Carmine had already proven his toughness on the streets, but toughness alone wasn't enough to climb the Mafia ladder. Men who lasted in the mob knew how to balance loyalty and independence, how to follow orders while showing initiative. Carmine learned these lessons quickly. He didn't challenge authority recklessly. Instead, he watched, listened, and built his own reputation as someone dependable. That reputation earned him the attention of higher-ranking figures who began giving him larger tasks. One of the most important early chapters in Carmine's story came through his involvement in what later became known as the Gallo Crew. The Gallo brothers, Joey, Larry, and Albert, were ambitious, unpredictable, and eager to carve out their own piece of power within the Profaci family. Carmine found himself drawn into their orbit. He admired their boldness, and they, in turn, saw in him a useful ally, smart, calculating, and fearless. Together, they began to push boundaries in ways that drew both admiration and danger. Carmine's role in the Gallo Crew wasn't as loud or flamboyant as Joey Gallo's, but it was just as critical. While Joey thrived on attention and theatrics, Carmine was the strategist in the background. He preferred to work quietly, making sure the crew's operations stayed profitable and controlled. In a way, he balanced Joey's impulsiveness, providing a steady hand that the others trusted. It was during this time that Carmine's nickname, the Snake, began to mean more than just his fighting style. It came to symbolize his ability to slip into situations, adapt quickly, and survive when others might have fallen. The Profaci family itself, however, was heading toward turmoil. Joseph Profaci had a reputation for being both controlling and stingy. He demanded loyalty and tribute from his men, but often gave little back in return. The Gallos, ambitious as they were, began to resent this imbalance. They felt they were doing the hard work and taking the risks, while Profaci reaped the rewards. This resentment slowly grew into open conflict, and Carmine, tied closely to the Gallos, found himself in the middle of what would become one of the most dramatic internal wars in Mafia history. But before the open conflict broke out, Carmine continued to establish himself as a capable and resourceful man. He was not afraid of danger, but he also didn't chase it recklessly. When disputes arose between crews, Carmine often found himself acting as a mediator, trying to prevent small sparks from turning into uncontrollable fires. This ability to keep a cool head under pressure became one of his defining traits. At the same time, Carmine was building his personal life. He had married and was raising children, balancing the role of family man with his growing responsibilities in the underworld. Those who knew him personally described him as a man who could be warm and loyal to those he loved, but who also had an unshakable sense of authority. At home, he could be gentle. On the streets, he was decisive, and, when necessary, ruthless. By the late 1950s, Carmine was firmly entrenched in the Profaci family structure, but the growing tensions between the Gallos and Profaci threatened to destabilize everything. The Gallos accused Profaci of greed, claiming he was hoarding profits while demanding more from his men. Profaci, in turn, saw the Gallos as dangerous upstarts who were disrespecting the order he had worked so hard to build. Carmine, loyal to the Gallos, was inevitably pulled deeper into the conflict. When open hostilities finally erupted in the early 1960s, Carmine Persico became one of the central figures. The Gallo-Profaci War was marked not only by street-level violence but also by shifting alliances and betrayals. Carmine's role was complex. Though aligned with the Gallos, he had a mind of his own and often sought ways to position himself advantageously. In the chaotic world of Mafia wars, survival often depended on knowing when to act boldly and when to step back. Carmine had a gift for timing, and it kept him alive during some of the most dangerous years in Mafia history. One of the key moments that showcased Carmine's abilities was his involvement in ambushes and retaliations during the Profaci-Gallo conflict. The battles between the two sides were not always straightforward gunfights. Often, they involved careful planning, surveillance, and patience. Carmine excelled in this environment. He knew how to wait for the right moment, how to use information to his advantage, and how to make moves that minimized his own risk while maximizing impact. These years also cemented Carmine's reputation among both allies and rivals. Allies saw him as dependable, intelligent, and trustworthy. Rivals, on the other hand, recognized him as a dangerous opponent, someone who could not be underestimated. In the Mafia world, where perception was often as important as reality, this dual reputation gave Carmine significant power. But Carmine was not merely a soldier following orders. Even in his 20s, he demonstrated an ability to think beyond the immediate battle. He was beginning to envision a future where he could rise above the constant infighting and claim real authority. The Gallos were bold but reckless, often putting themselves at odds with powerful figures. Carmine, while loyal, also saw the risks in tying himself too tightly to their volatile ambitions. He began to cultivate relationships outside the Gallo circle, maintaining ties with other influential figures in the Profaci family. This balancing act was dangerous, but it was also what set him apart. The world around him was changing too. Law enforcement was paying closer attention to organized crime. The 1957 Apalachian meeting, where dozens of Mafia leaders were arrested in upstate New York, had exposed the national scope of the Mafia to the public. Suddenly, the authorities were no longer willing to pretend that organized crime was just a collection of local gangs. The five families were under scrutiny, and the Profaci family was no exception. For Carmine, this meant that every move carried greater risk. A misstep could draw the attention of the police, and with that came the possibility of prison or worse. Despite these dangers, Carmine's ambitions only grew. He was not content to remain a subordinate forever. The lessons he learned during the Gallo-Profaci War taught him that leadership required more than just strength. It required patience, strategy, and the ability to inspire loyalty even in uncertain times. Carmine had all these qualities, and he began to see himself as someone destined for more. The streets of Brooklyn still whispered his name. To some, he was the fearless young man who could outthink and outfight his rivals. To others, he was a dangerous figure whose ambitions could not be contained. But to Carmine himself, he was simply moving along a path that felt inevitable. The boy from Carroll Gardens had grown into a man of influence, and the opportunities before him were only expanding. As the 1960s unfolded, Carmine Persico's story would shift from that of a young enforcer to that of a man shaping the destiny of an entire crime family. The conflicts that defined the Profaci era were only the beginning. Ahead lay betrayals, alliances, and decisions that would place him at the very center of New York's underworld. For now, though, he remained in the shadows, quietly building his power, carefully balancing loyalty with ambition. The snake was patient, and patience, he knew, was often the deadliest weapon of all. The early 1960s were a turbulent time in New York's underworld. The Profaci family, once steady under Joseph Profaci's leadership, was unraveling as tensions boiled over with the Gallo brothers. Carmine Persico stood right in the middle of it all, a young man with one foot in loyalty to the Gallos and the other in the wider world of the family. He was still in his 20s, but already his name carried weight on the streets. People knew that if Carmine was involved, it wasn't just another neighborhood scuffle. It was serious business. The Gallo-Profaci war escalated quickly. At first, it was about money, about what the Gallos believed was unfair tribute being demanded by Profaci. They were tired of working hard only to see most of their earnings disappear into the boss's pocket. Joey Gallo, the loudest and boldest of the brothers, wanted to challenge the system directly. Carmine, being close to the crew, went along with the plan. Though he wasn't as brash as Joey, his mind was always working several steps ahead, considering the possible outcomes of every move. When the Gallos made their first dramatic strike against Profaci's leadership by kidnapping several of his top men in 1961, Carmine was deeply involved in the planning. It was a bold, dangerous act, the kind that would either bring them more power or destroy them entirely. For a time, it seemed like the plan might succeed. The kidnappings put pressure on Profaci, forcing him to negotiate. But Profaci was no ordinary boss. He had resources, allies, and a deep reservoir of patience. He negotiated his men's release, but in the shadows, he was already planning his revenge. For Carmine, this was a turning point. He saw firsthand how volatile the world of organized crime could be. One day you held the upper hand, and the next you were scrambling to survive. The streets buzzed with rumors and fear, and no one knew where the next bullet might come from. Through it all, Carmine displayed the qualities that made him stand out. He was calm under pressure, careful with his words, and always thinking ahead. Allies noticed this and respected him for it, while rivals knew he was not someone to take lightly. The war dragged on, leaving bodies and broken alliances in its wake. Carmine's name appeared in police reports more and more frequently as detectives tried to map out the players. To the outside world, he was becoming a symbol of the younger generation of mobsters, those who were willing to challenge tradition and authority. To those inside the life, he was seen as someone with both courage and cunning, a rare combination that hinted at a bright, if dangerous, future. But Carmine's path was never simple. As the war intensified, he began to distance himself from Joey Gallo's more reckless actions. Joey thrived on chaos, often making decisions that put everyone around him at risk. Carmine, on the other hand, valued control and stability. He wanted to rise, but he didn't want to burn every bridge along the way. Slowly, he began to shift his loyalties, maintaining his ties to the gallows while quietly reaching out to figures loyal to Profaci. It was a delicate dance, one that required perfect timing and careful judgment. When Joseph Profaci fell ill and eventually died in 1962, the family's leadership entered a period of uncertainty. For Carmine, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, the absence of a strong leader made the family vulnerable to outside threats and internal divisions. On the other hand, it created space for ambitious men like him to maneuver. Carmine knew that the balance of power was shifting, and he positioned himself carefully to benefit from the coming changes. During these years, Carmine also had to contend with increasing pressure from law enforcement. The police were cracking down harder on organized crime, especially after the national attention brought by the Appalachian Meeting in 1957. Carmine's name was not yet at the top of their list, but he was no stranger to surveillance and investigations. Detectives knew who he was, where he lived, and the circles he moved in. Every step he took had to be measured against the possibility of legal consequences. Despite the risks, Carmine's influence grew. His ability to survive the chaos of the Gallo-Profaci war without being sidelined or eliminated was proof of his resilience. Many men had fallen during that period, caught between shifting alliances or undone by their own rashness. Carmine, however, remained standing, stronger than before. It was during this time that older members of the family began to see him, not just as a young enforcer, but as a potential leader. By the mid-1960s, Carmine was beginning to envision himself at the head of the family one day. He was still young, but he had already accumulated the kind of experience that few others his age could claim. He had been through a war, navigated shifting loyalties, and built relationships with key figures across the underworld. His ambition was clear, but he never broadcast it openly. He was careful to maintain the image of a loyal soldier, someone who followed orders and respected the hierarchy. Behind that image, though, his mind was always moving, planning for the future. At home, Carmine continued to maintain the life of a family man. To his children, he was a father, not a gangster. He tried to shield them from the darker aspects of his world, though it was impossible to completely separate the two. His home life gave him a sense of grounding, a reminder of what he was working for. But it also created vulnerabilities, for in the Mafia world, family could be both a source of strength and a target. The next stage of Carmine's journey was marked by the gradual transformation of the Profaci family into what would later be known as the Colombo family. The power vacuum left by Profaci's death created opportunities for others to step forward. Carmine, with his combination of experience, intelligence, and ambition, was perfectly positioned to rise in the new order. He was still young, but those around him could see that he had the potential to shape the future of the family in ways that few others could. The lessons Carmine had learned during the Gallo conflict never left him. He understood the importance of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act. He knew that power gained too quickly could vanish just as fast. He also understood the need to balance fear and respect. Too much of one without the other could destabilize leadership. These lessons would guide him in the years to come, as he moved closer and closer to the top. The streets of Brooklyn whispered with his name, carrying stories of his resilience and ambition. Some saw him as a survivor, someone who could adapt to any situation. Others saw him as a rising star, destined to lead. For Carmine, the whispers were just background noise. He knew where he wanted to go, and he knew that getting there would take time, strategy, and an unwavering sense of determination. As the 1960s continued, Carmine Persico's role in the family only grew. He was no longer just the young man from Carroll Gardens who earned his nickname in street fights. He was becoming a figure of authority, someone whose opinion mattered in the halls of power. And though the road ahead was filled with dangers, rivalries, betrayals, and the constant threat of law enforcement, Carmine was ready. He had survived the wars of his youth, and now he was preparing for something far greater, the long game of leadership in one of the most dangerous organizations in America. The boy who had once been called the Snake for his quickness in fights was now living up to the name in a far deeper sense. He was patient, adaptable, and always ready to strike when the moment was right. And in the shadowy world of New York's Mafia, those qualities would carry him farther than anyone could have imagined. The mid-1960s were years of reshaping for the Profaci family, now transitioning into what would become the Colombo family. After the death of Joseph Profaci, the family was left unsteady. Old rivalries still burned, especially with the Gallo brothers, who were unwilling to let go of their grievances. In the middle of this tension was Carmine Persico, young but already recognized as a man of influence. He had survived the chaos of the earlier conflict, and that survival alone earned him respect. But it was not just survival that defined him. It was the way he carried himself, measured, calculating, and unafraid to make decisions that others hesitated to make. Joseph Magliocco briefly stepped in as boss after Profaci's passing, but his time was short-lived. The higher circles of the Mafia in New York were suspicious of him, and his ties to old Profaci structures made him a weak link. In the secretive commission that oversaw all families, there was little confidence in his leadership. Carmine, watching from his position in the ranks, understood that power was shifting once again, and he needed to align himself carefully. Every move in those years mattered, for a wrong step could not only ruin his career, but also cost his life. Around this time, the Gallos continued to rebel. Joey Gallo, recently out of prison, reignited hostilities, determined to break free of the old order. His crew roamed the streets, launching attacks and staging bold moves that unsettled everyone. Carmine had once been close to them, but he saw how unpredictable they had become. He admired their courage but no longer trusted their judgment. Instead, he drifted closer to the circles that sought stability. He knew that the family needed someone strong, but also smart enough to hold things together. It was in this storm that Joseph Colombo rose to prominence. Colombo was a younger figure himself, with a sharp mind and an ability to gather people around him. He understood public relations in a way few mobsters did, and in time, he would use that talent to shape his image both inside and outside the Mafia. Carmine, still in his early 30s, recognized Colombo as someone worth aligning with. While Colombo worked to secure his role as the head of the family, Carmine became one of his most trusted men. Their relationship was not built on loud gestures or promises, but on the quiet recognition of each other's abilities. The years under Colombo were a test for Carmine. He was given responsibilities that demanded discretion and authority, and he carried them out with skill. He became known not just as an enforcer, but as a man who could solve problems, negotiate, and steady the ship in turbulent waters. He was no longer only a street figure. He was now part of the machinery that kept the family functioning. But the streets never stayed quiet for long. In the late 1960s, Joey Gallo and his supporters sparked more waves of violence. Shootings, ambushes, and betrayals became part of the daily rhythm once again. Carmine's name surfaced in whispers of retaliations, of moves carefully calculated to weaken the opposition without drawing unnecessary attention. Detectives and newspapers began to pay closer attention to him. To the public, he was still just one name among many in the web of organized crime. But to those inside the life, he was quickly becoming indispensable. Law enforcement pressure grew in parallel with his rise. The FBI and local police were intensifying their efforts, using new tools like wiretaps, informants, and surveillance. For Carmine, this meant adapting. He learned to move carefully, to keep conversations short, to avoid unnecessary exposure. He understood that surviving in the Mafia was not just about outsmarting rivals, but also about outthinking the law. His ability to remain elusive only added to his mystique, making him seem untouchable in the eyes of many. While Colombo worked to establish his leadership, Carmine worked to deepen his influence in the ranks. He was young compared to many of the old-timers, but his combination of toughness and intelligence gave him credibility. Men listened when he spoke, not because he shouted the loudest, but because his words carried weight. He did not waste time with empty threats. If Carmine promised action, it was carried out. By the end of the 1960s, Carmine was no longer just a rising star. He was a central figure in the Colombo family. His loyalty to Colombo was clear, but so was his ambition. Those who observed him closely could see that he was not content to remain in the shadows forever. He was patient, yes, but his eyes were always fixed on the larger picture. He wanted more than influence. He wanted authority. It was also during this period that Carmine began to build a reputation outside the family. Other Mafia families in New York, the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Genovese's, the Bonanos, took note of him. He was young, but he had already survived wars that had consumed men twice his age. He was respected for his ability to adapt, to strike when necessary, and to know when to wait. This respect crossed family lines, an important marker in a world where alliances often stretched beyond one's immediate circle. Despite his rising influence, Carmine never lost the balance between his public and private life. At home, he remained devoted to his family. To his children, he was simply their father, a presence that, despite his demanding lifestyle, remained steady. To neighbors, he was the man from Carroll Gardens, often described as polite and unassuming. This duality, tough enforcer in the Mafia, quiet family man at home, added to the complexity of his character. As the new decade approached, Carmine was stepping into a role that would define the rest of his life. He was still young by Mafia standards, but he had already accumulated the scars and lessons of a veteran. He understood the delicate balance of power, the value of patience, and the importance of loyalty. Most importantly, he understood that leadership was not just about fear, but about respect. The Colombo family itself was entering a new chapter. Under Joseph Colombo's leadership, the family gained both attention and notoriety. Colombo's decision to create the Italian-American Civil Rights League brought the family into the public eye in unprecedented ways. Carmine watched this development carefully. While some admired Colombo's boldness, others worried that such attention would attract more heat from law enforcement. Carmine, ever cautious, saw both the potential and the danger in Colombo's strategy. The streets of New York were changing too. The old neighborhood ties were loosening as new generations came of age. The Mafia still held enormous influence, but it was facing challenges from shifting economies, rising law enforcement pressure, and the unpredictable moves of younger crews. Carmine, with his blend of old-school respect and forward-looking calculation, was perfectly positioned to navigate these changes. By the early 1970s, his role within the family was cemented. He was no longer just following orders, he was giving them. Men sought his guidance, and his voice carried authority at meetings. While Colombo remained the figurehead, Carmine was increasingly seen as the man shaping the family's day-to-day direction. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, never loud, never flamboyant, but always present. That quietness, combined with his resilience and sharp mind, made him stand out. He was not a man who relied on theatrics to assert himself. He let his actions speak, and those actions consistently reinforced his reputation. The story of Carmine Persico was still unfolding, but by the close of the 1960s, one thing was clear. He was no longer just part of the family, he was a force within it. He had survived wars, shifted alliances, outmaneuvered rivals, and caught the attention of both allies and enemies. The young man who had once fought on the streets of Brooklyn was now shaping the future of an entire crime family. And though he had already achieved much, in his own mind, he was only just beginning. The years ahead would bring new challenges, greater responsibilities, more dangerous rivalries, and the ever-present shadow of law enforcement. But Carmine Persico was ready. He had the patience of a strategist, the instincts of a fighter, and the ambition of a leader. The stage was set for his transformation from respected figure to something far greater, the man who would one day be recognized as the enduring leader of the Colombo family. The 1970s opened with a strange mix of promise and danger for the Colombo family. Joseph Colombo had taken bold steps that no other Mafia boss had dared attempt. He created the Italian-American Civil Rights League, standing on stages, giving interviews, and drawing attention to discrimination against Italian Americans. Thousands rallied behind him, parades were held, speeches were made, and for the first time, the Mafia was indirectly mentioned in a national conversation, not through whispered scandals in newspapers, but through televised rallies filled with families waving flags. To the public, it seemed as though Colombo was becoming a kind of community leader, a champion of his people. But inside the world of organized crime, opinions were divided. Many old bosses frowned upon the attention. The Mafia's greatest strength had always been its ability to operate in the shadows, to influence quietly, never openly. Colombo's activism was seen as reckless, even dangerous. Law enforcement, which had already been tightening its grip, now had every reason to increase its scrutiny. Carmine Persico stood close enough to Colombo to watch all of this unfold. He admired the man's ability to command loyalty and gather crowds, but he also recognized the risks. Carmine's instincts had always leaned toward caution. He was not one to put himself in front of cameras, not one to invite unnecessary attention. He preferred the old ways: silent influence, hidden power, decisions made in dimly lit rooms far from microphones. Still, he remained loyal. Colombo trusted Carmine, and Carmine knew the value of that trust. The family needed stability, and Colombo's position as boss offered at least a structure they could rally behind. But beneath that structure, shifts were taking place. Power was quietly being redistributed, and Carmine was there to catch what fell through the cracks. In 1971, the Civil Rights League reached its peak, drawing tens of thousands to its rallies in New York. Reporters marveled at the sight of so many people gathered under Colombo's banner. Yet, the more attention he gained, the more enemies he attracted. Not only from within the Mafia world, but also from political and law enforcement circles. Powerful people disliked the idea of a Mafia boss standing on stages and declaring himself a voice for the people. They saw it as arrogance, a taunt to the authorities who had long struggled to crack the secretive world of organized crime. And then, in June of 1971, at one of his public rallies in Columbus Circle, everything changed. Colombo was shot in front of the crowd, collapsing on stage while chaos erupted around him. The gunman was quickly subdued but was himself killed on the spot, leaving behind more questions than answers. Colombo survived the shooting, but the bullet left him paralyzed, confined to a hospital bed for the rest of his life. For the Colombo family, the shooting was both a tragedy and a turning point. The man who had drawn thousands now lay motionless, his voice silenced. Leadership suddenly became a vacuum, and vacuums in the Mafia rarely stayed empty for long. Rival factions began to stir, each hoping to control the family's future. It was in this moment of uncertainty that Carmine Persico stepped forward more than ever. He had always been careful, always deliberate. Now, with Colombo incapacitated, Carmine became one of the central figures holding the family together. He was young compared to other contenders, but his track record spoke for itself. He had survived wars, made smart choices, and earned loyalty from men who respected both his toughness and his judgment. He didn't need to shout to make himself heard. He didn't need a parade to prove his power. He simply acted, and his presence was enough. The years that followed Colombo's shooting were turbulent. Different factions within the family tried to assert dominance. Some pushed for new leadership. Others claimed loyalty to Colombo even in his weakened state. But through it all, Carmine positioned himself as indispensable. He was not reckless. He did not rush for the throne. Instead, he waited, building alliances, making sure his influence extended into every corner of the family. Law enforcement, of course, noticed his rise. His name appeared more frequently in investigations, in wiretaps, and in reports. Detectives described him as calculating, a man who avoided the spotlight but whose hand could be felt in many of the family's affairs. To the outside world, his reputation grew, still shadowy, still mysterious, but undeniably powerful. In the early 1970s, as the family reorganized itself, Carmine became one of its most vital leaders. He balanced the chaos, ensured operations continued, and presented himself as someone others could rely on. His ability to manage men and situations became his greatest strength. He did not rely solely on fear. He inspired a kind of respect that made people follow him willingly. At the same time, Carmine never lost sight of the larger picture. He understood that the Colombo family was only one part of a larger system. The 5 families of New York each held their place in the delicate balance of power, and to overstep or to appear unstable could invite disaster. Carmine worked carefully to ensure that his family remained relevant and respected among the others. He spoke carefully with allies, extended hands where needed, and avoided unnecessary conflicts with rivals. He was building not just influence within his own family, but credibility across the entire underworld. Yet ambition is never without risk. In those years, whispers began to circulate that Carmine's quiet climb was leading toward a larger goal, the top position itself. Some men respected this, others feared it. Within the Mafia, ambition was both admired and distrusted. To aim too openly for power was dangerous, but Carmine was subtle. He never declared himself a challenger, never made dramatic moves. He simply allowed time and circumstances to carry him closer to where he wanted to be. The rest of the 1970s unfolded as a test of patience and endurance. The family was still under the shadow of Colombo, who, though alive, could no longer lead. His condition lingered in the background, a reminder of the risks of too much attention. Carmine used this time to show that he was a man of steadiness. He kept operations running, mediated disputes, and proved again and again that he could be relied upon. Outside the family, the city itself was changing. New York in the 1970s was a place of grit and struggle, with economic troubles, rising crime, and shifting neighborhoods. The Mafia still held influence, but it faced growing competition from new criminal enterprises, from drug trade networks, and from law enforcement's increasing focus. Carmine understood that adapting to these changes was vital. He was not afraid to adjust strategies, to shift focus when needed, always ensuring that his family's interests remained protected. By the mid-1970s, Carmine Persico was no longer seen as just a promising figure. He was recognized as one of the pillars holding the Colombo family together. Though the official titles shifted back and forth, though names were moved around to satisfy appearances, the reality on the ground was clear. Carmine was central. His voice carried weight, his decisions shaped outcomes, and his presence provided stability in an otherwise uncertain era. As the decade drew to a close, Carmine's role only deepened. Younger men entering the life looked to him as a model of how to rise, not through reckless displays, but through patience, resilience, and quiet calculation. Older men, once skeptical of his youth, now treated him with respect earned over years of consistency. He had become the bridge between generations, respected by both sides, trusted by many, feared by some, but ignored by none. And yet, in Carmine's mind, the journey was still unfinished. He had achieved much, but he knew the path ahead would bring even greater challenges. The Mafia was entering a new age, one of changing dynamics, of shifting alliances, of relentless pressure from law enforcement. To survive and thrive, a leader would need more than toughness. He would need intelligence, adaptability, and vision. Carmine believed he had all of these, and as the 1980s approached, he was ready to prove it. The boy from Carroll Gardens, once just another kid on the Brooklyn streets, had now become one of the most powerful men in New York's underworld. But his story was far from over. The next chapter would test him in ways even he could not have imagined, and the choices he made would define not just his own future, but the legacy of the Colombo family for decades to come. The dawn of the 1980s brought with it a new era for organized crime in New York. For decades, the Mafia had thrived on a delicate balance. Power shared among the five families, influence quietly spread across unions, construction, shipping, and the streets. But by the 1980s, law enforcement had grown sharper, the FBI more determined, and the public more aware. The Mafia was no longer the unseen giant it once had been. It was now under a magnifying glass, and every move risked exposure. For Carmine Persico, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. He had spent the 1970s proving himself indispensable, navigating the Colombo family through the uncertain years after Joseph Colombo's shooting. He had been patient, building respect and authority step by step. By the early 1980s, many inside and outside the family regarded him as the true leader, regardless of what official titles were shuffled around to confuse investigators. Carmine had become the face of stability, the figure who tied everything together. But with power came responsibility, and with responsibility came risk. The Colombo family had never been the largest of the five families, but it held influence in vital industries, particularly construction and labor unions. Persico saw these as lifelines, areas where steady profits could be made without the chaos of reckless street crime. He wanted his family to grow stronger through discipline and organization. Yet not everyone in the Mafia shared his vision. Some were drawn to the quick money of the drug trade, even though it brought unwanted attention. Carmine himself was cautious about narcotics. He knew it could bring fortune, but it also carried a heavy cost, severe legal penalties, and a kind of heat that could burn entire families to the ground. Despite his caution, whispers grew that factions within the Colombo family were dabbling in drugs, some with or without approval. Disputes began to rise. Carmine worked to keep control, using his authority and influence to rein in reckless behavior. But he also understood that he couldn't be everywhere at once. Leadership meant trust, and trust always carried risks. The larger Mafia world was also shifting. John Gotti was on the rise within the Gambino family, his bold style drawing attention. Other bosses, like Paul Castellano, sought to reshape the way their families operated, focusing more on white-collar crimes. Each family had its own dynamics, its own struggles. Persico kept a careful eye on all of it, making sure that his own family remained steady in the midst of these changes. But the greatest challenge did not come from rival families. It came from the government. In 1981, the FBI launched one of its most ambitious projects yet, a full-scale attack on organized crime, built around the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO. This law allowed prosecutors to tie leaders to crimes committed by their underlings, even if the bosses themselves never directly touched the illegal work. For the Mafia, this was a game-changer. The very structure that had once protected them, the layers of insulation, the careful chain of command, was now being used against them. Wiretaps, undercover agents, and informants became the FBI's strongest tools. Meetings once thought to be private were now recorded. Conversations whispered in back rooms were transcribed in government reports. Carmine, cautious as he was, could not escape this new reality. His words, his moves, his very presence began to appear in surveillance files. Still, he held firm. Persico was no stranger to pressure. He had survived gang wars, family feuds, and shifting alliances. He believed he could survive this too, if he stayed disciplined and smart. He urged his men to be careful, to avoid careless talk, to remember that law enforcement was listening. But even he could not anticipate just how deeply the government was preparing to strike. By the mid-1980s, the stage was set for what became known as the Mafia Commission trial. Prosecutors, led by Rudy Giuliani, aimed not just to arrest mobsters, but to dismantle the very structure of organized crime in New York. They charged the bosses of the 5 families with running a nationwide criminal empire. It was an unprecedented move, one that shocked the underworld and made headlines around the country. Carmine Persico found himself at the center of it. Despite his careful style, despite his preference for staying in the shadows, he was named alongside some of the most powerful figures in the Mafia. The charges painted him as one of the key architects of organized crime, a man whose influence stretched far beyond what many in the public had realized. For Carmine, it was both recognition of his rise and a dangerous threat to everything he had built. As the trial loomed, Persico made a choice that surprised many. He decided to represent himself in court. He believed no lawyer could defend him as well as he could defend himself. To some, it seemed like arrogance. To others, it was a demonstration of confidence and intelligence. Carmine studied legal documents, prepared arguments, and faced prosecutors head-on. In the courtroom, he carried himself with the same calm presence he had always shown in the underworld. He was not a man easily rattled, but no amount of preparation could fully shield him from the storm. The government's case was strong, built on years of surveillance and testimony. The jury listened, the press reported, and the nation watched as one of the most historic trials in organized crime history unfolded. In 1986, the verdicts came down. Carmine Persico was convicted, alongside other mafia leaders, and sentenced to what amounted to life in prison. For many, it seemed like the end. The government declared victory, saying the mafia's backbone had been broken. Headlines hailed the success of the commission trial as a turning point in America's fight against organized crime. But Carmine Persico's story did not end with a sentence. Even behind bars, his influence remained. Men still respected him, still looked to him for guidance, still saw him as the head of the Colombo family. Prison walls could not erase the years of loyalty he had built, the reputation he had earned, or the quiet authority that had carried him so far. For Persico, the challenge was now different. No longer could he walk the streets of New York. No longer could he hold face-to-face meetings in back rooms. Yet his mind was sharp, his will unbroken. He found ways to remain connected, to guide his family from within the prison system. It was not the life he once imagined, but it was still a life of influence. The 1980s then were both his greatest triumph and his greatest trial. He had risen higher than most could have imagined, carving out a place among the most powerful men in New York's underworld. But he had also faced the full force of the law, a force that stripped him of his freedom, but not of his role. In the strange balance of the mafia world, he remained a boss, even as he served a sentence meant to last the rest of his days. As the decade closed, new generations were entering the life. Men who had grown up hearing his name, men who saw him as a figure of strength even from a distance. Carmine Persico had become something more than just a leader. He had become a symbol of survival, of resilience, of the ability to endure even when the odds were stacked high. And in his own mind, he was not finished. The story of Carmine Persico, the boy from Carroll Gardens who had risen to sit among the commission, was still unfolding. Prison was only another battlefield, and Carmine had never been one to give up the fight. Prison bars may have closed around Carmine Persico, but in many ways his grip on the Colombo family tightened even more. The Mafia had long adapted to its leaders serving time. Influence didn't always require a seat in a cafe or a late-night meeting on a Brooklyn street corner. Power could flow through visits, coded letters, loyal intermediaries, and above all, reputation. And Carmine Persico's reputation was ironclad. To his men, he was not a boss who had been toppled by the government. He was the boss, period. The late 1980s and early 1990s were turbulent years for the Colombo family. Unlike the Gambinos or the Genoveses, who managed to keep relative peace under steady leadership, the Colombos were plagued by infighting. And at the center of it all, even from behind prison walls, stood Carmine. His very insistence on holding the reins while incarcerated created tension. Some believed the family needed a street boss, someone fully present on the outside to make quick decisions and protect interests. Others argued that loyalty demanded obedience to Carmine, no matter where he sat. Carmine was not willing to let go. For him, leadership was not a temporary title that could be handed off. It was the culmination of decades of battles, negotiations, and sacrifices. He had fought his way up, survived wars and betrayals, endured the government's heaviest strike. To surrender his role would not just be a loss of authority, it would be an admission that the government had won. That was something he would never allow. So, he ruled from prison, issuing orders through trusted lieutenants. The arrangement was workable at first. His men still respected his vision, his discipline, and his ability to keep the family steady in the larger world of organized crime. But as the months turned to years, frustrations began to grow. The streets moved quickly. Opportunities came and went. Rival families expanded. Law enforcement tightened its grip, and the Colombo family needed swift decisions. Persico's long-distance rule, while powerful, was sometimes too slow. This tension birthed one of the bloodiest chapters in the Colombo family's history. In the early 1990s, a factional war broke out within the family. On one side stood those loyal to Carmine Persico, determined to keep his leadership intact no matter what. On the other side stood rivals who believed new leadership was needed, someone present and active on the streets, someone not shackled behind bars. The most prominent challenger was Victor Orena, who had been acting boss for a time with Persico's blessing but later sought to take control outright. What began as quiet whispers of dissent soon escalated into open conflict. Gunfights erupted across New York as Persico loyalists and Orena's supporters clashed. Streets that had once been controlled by quiet deals now rang with the sound of violence. It was no longer a family in harmony, but one tearing itself apart from the inside. The government, always eager to exploit weakness, poured resources into investigating and prosecuting. The Colombo family, once a steady player in New York's underworld, became the focus of constant headlines. For Carmine, the war was both painful and inevitable. From his cell, he tried to guide his loyalists to hold together what was breaking apart. He reminded them of the principles that had carried the family for decades: discipline, loyalty, patience. But the realities of the street were harsher than ideals. Men were dying. Allies were turning on each other. And the family's profits, once strong, dwindled as energy was wasted on internal fighting instead of building power. Still, Persico's influence could not be ignored. Even as Orena's faction fought fiercely, many in the Mafia world continued to recognize Carmine as the true head of the Colombo family. His decades of leadership, his history with the commission, his unyielding spirit, these were things that could not be erased by a prison cell. The very fact that men were willing to die for him while he was incarcerated spoke to the weight of his authority. The war dragged on, and by the mid-1990s, its cost was undeniable. Dozens of lives were lost, the family's reputation was battered, and law enforcement had seized the opportunity to weaken them further. In the larger world of organized crime, the Colombos had fallen behind. While the Genoveses maintained order, and the Gambinos weathered their own storms, The Colombos seemed locked in a cycle of self-destruction. Yet through it all, Carmine's name endured. In prison, he adjusted to his reality with a mixture of defiance and acceptance. He studied, he read, he thought deeply about the world beyond the bars. His health, never perfect, began to show signs of strain as the years passed, but his mind remained sharp. He took pride in the loyalty of those who still followed him, and he refused to bend to despair. To him, survival was victory. As long as he breathed and commanded loyalty, the government had not destroyed him. There was a strange paradox in Carmine's position. On one hand, his insistence on ruling from prison had fractured his family, sparking a war that left them weaker than ever. On the other, his refusal to surrender ensured that his authority was never fully eclipsed. Even in chaos, he remained the central figure. His enemies within the family fought because of him. His allies fought for him. In both cases, his presence was undeniable. By the late 1990s, the war had burned out, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The Colombo family was smaller, more vulnerable, but still standing. And Carmine was still their leader. Other bosses had risen and fallen, some to gunfire, others to betrayals, still others to the relentless march of law enforcement. Yet Persico, despite his long sentence, remained a constant. His story had become one of endurance, of clinging to power not through flamboyance or brutality, but through sheer will and the loyalty he had cultivated over decades. As the century turned, Carmine Persico was no longer the young man from Carroll Gardens who had once chased power with a mix of ambition and recklessness. He was an older man now, graying, living out his years in the confines of prison. But in the minds of many, he was still the same figure he had always been, the uncrowned boss of the Colombo family, the man who never truly let go. The Colombo family itself faced an uncertain future. Younger members entered, some drawn by old legends, others by the promise of easy money. But they stepped into a world very different from the one Carmine had known in his prime. The government's pressure was relentless, surveillance was everywhere, and the romanticized vision of the Mafia had given way to a harsher reality. Still, for those who remembered, Persico's story was a reminder of what it meant to rise, to endure, and to lead. Even when circumstances seemed impossible, Carmine's life had been marked by battles. Some won, some lost, but always fought with an unwavering sense of determination. And even as he spent year after year behind bars, his influence rippled outward. Men whispered his name with respect, even fear. Prosecutors acknowledged his resilience. Journalists marveled at his longevity, and the streets, though changed, still echoed with the legacy of the man they called the Snake. As the 1990s closed and a new era dawned, Carmine Persico remained where he had been for so long. Behind prison walls, yet still central to the saga of the Mafia in New York. The battles were not over. His family, though scarred, was not finished, and the story of his endurance was still unfolding. The new millennium brought changes everywhere, and even the Mafia, once thought untouchable, was not immune. Surveillance technology advanced, law enforcement agencies became more coordinated, and public fascination with organized crime shifted from fear to curiosity. Movies and television romanticized or dramatized it, but the reality on the streets was far less glamorous. For Carmine Persico, locked away for decades, the turn of the century was another reminder of how much the world outside had moved on without him. Yet, despite the years and the walls that contained him, his hold over the Colombo family did not vanish. In fact, the dawn of the 2000s only solidified his strange position. He was the longest reigning mafia boss in America, a man who had outlasted rivals, wars, and government crackdowns. While others had risen and fallen, Persico remained. His authority came not from where he stood, but from what he represented. He was a living symbol of endurance, of leadership that refused to bend. Men who never even met him felt his presence, as though the weight of his history was enough to keep the family tethered to his rule. Still, the family itself was fragile. The war of the early 1990s had left scars that never fully healed. Many seasoned members were gone, either killed, imprisoned, or simply too wary of the risks to remain active. Younger recruits, lacking the discipline and codes of the old days, filled the gaps. They brought energy, but they also brought recklessness. Law enforcement found it easier to infiltrate and exploit these new ranks, catching them in wiretaps, stings, and informant deals. The Colombos, once feared as a steady and ruthless family, became known as unstable, plagued by internal divisions. Through all this, Persico still directed from his prison cell. Loyal relatives and close associates acted as his eyes and ears, carrying his word to the streets. His son, Alphonse, known as Alley Boy, took on more responsibility, attempting to hold the family together under his father's shadow. But even that was complicated. The younger Persico faced his own battles with law enforcement, and the weight of expectation was immense. Being the son of Carmine was both a privilege and a burden. Every move he made was scrutinized, every step compared to the standards set by the man who still loomed over the family. The FBI prosecutors and journalists continued to pay close attention to Carmine. To them, he was a relic from another era, yet still dangerous because of his reach. Reports often referred to him as the boss who wouldn't let go, the man who controlled a crime family from within the prison system. Some saw him as stubborn, unwilling to pass the torch. Others saw him as brilliant, a strategist who understood that his authority was the family's anchor in a time of chaos. Whatever the view, one truth remained: his name could not be ignored. Life in prison, however, was far from easy. Carmine was aging. Decades behind bars take their toll on even the strongest men. His health began to decline, with reports of various ailments that made day-to-day life more difficult. Yet even in frailty, he carried himself with a quiet dignity. He was known among fellow inmates as someone who did not brag, who did not whine, but who always carried an air of command. The guards recognized it, the prisoners respected it. Persico was not just another man doing time. He was a man who had built an empire and still carried its weight. As the years passed, the Mafia landscape in New York continued to shift. The Gambinos, Genoveses, Luccheses, and Bonanos all faced their own challenges, with bosses arrested, families infiltrated, and influence shrinking in many areas. Yet somehow the Colombos remained in the headlines, often because of the chaos within. Rival factions still simmered, arrests continued, and the family seemed to struggle more than its counterparts. But no matter what happened, Carmine's name surfaced. Prosecutors still pointed to him as the ultimate authority. His presence was a reminder that the past was not fully gone, that the old guard still cast long shadows. Inside prison, Persico adapted as best he could. He read constantly, often immersing himself in history and law. He took an interest in appeals, studying legal arguments, hoping for cracks in the government's case that might one day offer a chance of release. It was a slim hope. His sentence had been severe, but the act of fighting, of not surrendering, gave him purpose. To his family, he sent words of encouragement, reminders of discipline, and above all, the command to endure. If he could hold steady in his circumstances, then so could they. By the mid-2000s, Carmine Persico had become something of a legend not just within the Mafia, but in the broader world of crime lore. Writers described him as the man who wouldn't step down, the rare boss whose reign had outlasted almost everyone else's. Young men, fascinated by Mafia stories, would hear his name alongside the giants of the past, Luciano, Genovese, Gambino, and marvel that he was still alive, still leading, even from a prison cell. But legend and reality often differ. The reality was that Carmine's life was one of routine, confinement, and endurance. The clanging of cell doors, the monotony of prison meals, the endless waiting, all of it marked his days. Yet he bore it with a resolve that others admired. He was not broken, not even close. He remained sharp, still guiding his family in whatever way he could, still insisting that his story was not yet finished. The outside world changed rapidly during those years. Technology transformed communication. Surveillance grew nearly invisible, cameras on every corner, phones in every pocket. The criminal underworld was no longer what it had been when Carmine first rose. Deals that once required whispered conversations in the back of cafes could now be undone by a single wiretap or text message. Younger members, not realizing the depth of these changes, often stumbled, leaving themselves exposed. Carmine, with his old-school mentality, tried to instill in them the lessons of caution, of patience, of respect for silence. But teaching from afar was never the same as leading in person. Still, his grip held. Through relatives, through loyalists, through sheer reputation, Persico remained the head of the Colombo family well into the new century. Even as his health weakened, his authority did not collapse. There were always challengers, whispers of others who might seize control, but none fully succeeded. The Colombos, for all their turmoil, continued to orbit around Carmine's presence. For him, this was victory. To live this long, to endure the full weight of the government's efforts, to still be called boss decades after his imprisonment, this was proof of his resilience. The government may have locked him away, but they had never silenced him. His voice still carried across the walls, his decisions still shaped lives, his story still mattered. As the decade drew to a close, Carmine Persico was an older man now, weathered by time but unbroken. He had lived through wars, betrayals, indictments, and prison sentences, and still, his name commanded respect. The Mafia itself had changed, shrinking from the power it once wielded, but his place in its history was secure. He was the boss who endured, the man who would not step aside, the figure whose legend continued to grow even as his body weakened. The world outside might have forgotten many names, but not his. And as the 2010s approached, the story of Carmine Persico was not yet at its end. By the time the new decade began, Carmine Persico had lived through more chapters of the Mafia's history than almost any other man still alive. He was now in his mid-70s, serving a sentence that had already stretched longer than the careers of many other bosses combined. From his prison cell, he had watched the rise and fall of rival families, the decline of the Mafia's power in New York, and the relentless tightening of the government's grip on organized crime. And yet, for all of this, he still carried the title of boss of the Colombo crime family. This was not an ordinary accomplishment. Most Mafia leaders either stepped down, were forced out, or died in violent wars. Carmine had survived assassination attempts, betrayals, court cases, and family wars that ripped apart his organization. He had even survived the bitter years of the early 1990s when the Colombos seemed ready to destroy themselves. Other bosses had been replaced while he remained. His longevity made him a living reminder of an era when the Mafia seemed invincible. Yet age was beginning to weigh heavily upon him. The years behind bars had taken their toll, not just physically but also emotionally. His health was no longer strong. Reports from those who knew him mentioned arthritis, heart issues, and the strain of prison life. Still, Carmine carried himself with quiet pride. He was not the kind of man to complain openly, nor was he one to beg for sympathy. Even as an older man, he exuded authority, and both inmates and guards treated him with a measure of respect. The Colombo family itself was no longer the force it had once been. In the 1950s and 1960s, the family had been feared and respected. They controlled unions, construction sites, loan sharking operations, and gambling dens throughout Brooklyn and Queens. But by the 2000s and 2010s, much of that influence had eroded. The government had dismantled rackets, seized assets, and flipped informants. Younger members of the family were often reckless, failing to follow the old codes of silence and discipline. Wiretaps and undercover operations caught them easily. And yet, no matter how diminished the family became, Carmine's name still carried weight. To prosecutors, he was still the official boss, even if he was operating from behind bars. To the men still loyal to him, he was the heart of the family, the man who had endured when all others had fallen. His long reign gave the family a sense of identity, a sense of continuity that other crime families lacked. His son, Alphonse, was meant to continue that legacy. Alphonse Persico, often called Alley Boy, had tried to step into his father's shoes, but his own legal troubles caught up with him. In the 2000s, Alphonse was arrested, tried, and eventually convicted in high-profile cases. With his son locked away, Carmine's dynasty faced a new challenge. The dream of handing the family from father to son, continuing the bloodline of leadership, was interrupted by the reality of long prison sentences. Still, even with his son imprisoned, Carmine's influence did not vanish. His relatives and trusted associates continued to carry his word, ensuring that his wishes shaped the family's direction. By this time, Carmine had become something more than just a crime boss. He had become a symbol. To some, he was the last of the old-school Mafia leaders, a man who refused to bow to pressure, who kept his role until the end. To others, he was a stubborn figure whose refusal to step aside left his family in chaos. But whichever view people took, they could not ignore him. His very name was still powerful, still enough to command attention. As the 2010s moved forward, the Mafia in New York faced an identity crisis. The old power they once held over labor unions, the docks, and political influence had shrunk. They still existed, of course, but their reach was smaller, their profits thinner, and their grip on neighborhoods weaker. The public often thought of them more as legends than as an active force. Television and movies continued to paint them as figures of intrigue, but the reality was that their empire had faded, and yet through it all, Carmine Persico remained. Prison life by then was routine for him. He had been behind bars so long that it was more like home than the outside world. Younger inmates sometimes approached him, curious about his past, eager to hear his stories. Many were surprised by his calm demeanor. He was not boastful, not loud. He spoke carefully, measured, and always gave the impression of a man who thought 3 steps ahead. It was this quality that had helped him survive for so long. Even in his old age, he remained sharp, his mind working like a chess player's, always considering the next move. Health challenges grew more serious as the years went on. His body weakened, but his spirit did not. In conversations with family members during visits, he reminded them of the importance of unity, of loyalty, of patience. He encouraged them to keep the family's name alive, even if the glory days were behind them. His words carried the weight of a lifetime spent in the shadows of organized crime. Law enforcement, meanwhile, kept a close eye on the Colombos. Reports often described them as the most unstable of the 5 families, plagued by infighting and leadership struggles. Yet even these reports admitted that Carmine's presence remained central. Federal agents, prosecutors, and journalists all acknowledged that as long as he lived, he remained the boss. His refusal to step down, even from a prison cell, was part of what made his story unique. The world outside prison changed dramatically in those years. Technology transformed society. Smartphones, social media, and the internet became tools of everyday life. For Carmine, who had entered prison before such things existed, the changes were astonishing. When visitors described the new world to him, it must have seemed almost unreal. And yet, in his own way, he adapted. He remained focused on the things that had always mattered to him: family, loyalty, and endurance. He also became something of a mystery to the public. Articles written about him often portrayed him as a shadowy figure, a man of contrasts. He was described as ruthless yet loyal, cunning yet disciplined. Some painted him as a villain, others as a strategist, but nearly all agreed that his story was remarkable. After all, how many men could say they had led one of the most infamous crime families in America for decades, even while serving life in prison? By his late 70s, Persico was one of the last living connections to the Mafia's golden age. Men like Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, and Joe Colombo were long gone. Even John Gotti, the famous Dapper Don, had passed away in prison years earlier. But Carmine endured. He became known as the immortal boss in some circles, not because he was untouchable, but because he simply refused to fade away. His name lived on, his authority intact, his story still unfolding. As the decade went on, he grew frailer. He relied more on medical care, more on the routines of the prison system. But even then, his presence was felt. Men in the outside world still invoked his name when making decisions, still claimed loyalty to him as the rightful boss. He may have been confined to a cell, but his shadow stretched across the streets of New York. By now, the world of the Mafia was a quieter place. No more street wars, no more nightly shootouts or public assassinations. Instead, it was quieter schemes, smaller operations, more cautious moves. Yet even in this quieter time, Carmine's voice remained part of the conversation. He was a link to the past, a man whose story reminded everyone of what the Mafia had once been. And as the decade neared its close, his story was not quite over. Though time was catching up with him, though his health was failing, though his family had been battered by years of prison sentences and betrayals, Carmine Persico remained a name spoken with respect and weight. He had outlasted nearly everyone else. He had endured when few thought he could. His reign was still unbroken even as his body weakened. It was clear that the final chapter of his story was approaching. But in true Carmine Persico fashion, he faced it with the same resolve that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. He had been many things: a fighter, a strategist, a survivor. But above all, he had been constant. For decades, through wars and prison walls, through betrayals and shifting times, he remained what he had always been, the boss of the Colombo family. And as the years wound down, the question was no longer whether Carmine Persico would survive, but how his story would finally come to an end, and what legacy he would leave behind in a world that had already changed beyond recognition. As the years slipped further into the 21st century, Carmine Persico became something rare, a relic of a world that had almost entirely faded away. He had been locked away for so long that whole generations of mobsters had risen and fallen outside his prison walls. The faces of power had changed. The very neighborhoods that once pulsed with Mafia influence had transformed, and the old way of life was no longer what it had been. Yet Carmine remained. In the eyes of both friends and enemies, he was still the boss. His ability to hold that title from behind bars was a testament to his willpower, his cunning, and the respect he commanded. By now, he was an old man, in his 80s, his health deteriorating. Prison is never kind to the body, and years of harsh routines, limited medical access, and the constant stress of confinement had worn him down. Arthritis made his joints ache, his eyesight grew weaker, and he found it harder to breathe. But his mind, even then, was sharp. He carried within him decades of experience, the kind of wisdom that cannot be taught but only lived. Younger inmates often looked at him with a mix of curiosity and awe, realizing they were in the presence of someone whose story stretched back to the days when men like Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, and Vito Genovese still walked the streets. The Colombo family he had once ruled over with firm control was no longer the same. It had been weakened by constant wars, betrayals, and government crackdowns. The family was still active, of course, still involved in small rackets, gambling, and loan sharking, but the power they once held was a shadow of what it used to be. Other families had suffered the same decline, but for the Colombos, it was even more pronounced. And yet Carmine's influence was not completely gone. Even from his prison cell, his name was spoken with reverence. For older members of the family, he was the symbol of tradition, a reminder of what the organization had once been. For law enforcement, he was still officially recognized as the boss, even in his advanced age and declining health. There was a kind of irony to his position. He had fought his entire life to climb to the top, to become the man who could dictate the moves of others, to have the final word. And he had succeeded, holding the role longer than almost anyone else. But his reign had been one lived largely behind prison walls. He had tasted freedom briefly after earlier arrests, but for the majority of his leadership he had been confined. Yet he still found a way to keep control, sending messages through loyal intermediaries, trusting his family members and longtime associates to carry out his wishes. It was a form of remote leadership that few could have maintained. Time, however, is the one opponent no man can defeat. As Carmine grew older, the visits from family members became more bittersweet. He loved seeing them, but he knew each visit might be the last. His children and grandchildren represented the life he could never fully enjoy, the ordinary happiness denied to him by the path he had chosen. He had built a legacy, but it had come at a cost, not only to him, but to those closest to him. Still, when he spoke to them, he encouraged pride, resilience, and loyalty. He wanted them to remember him not as a prisoner, but as a man who had endured, a man who had remained strong no matter the circumstances. Outside the prison walls, the world changed faster than ever. Technology transformed everything. The streets Carmine once knew in Brooklyn looked different. Old social clubs were long gone, replaced by shops and apartments. The neighborhoods that had once been controlled by the Mafia were now home to new generations of families, many of whom had no connection to the old ways. Younger people grew up hearing about the Mafia mostly through movies, television shows, or documentaries, often treating it as legend rather than lived history. For Carmine, it must have been strange to hear how people spoke about the life he had lived, sometimes exaggerating it, sometimes romanticizing it, but rarely capturing the harsh reality of it. Inside prison, he reflected more on his past. At night, in the silence of his cell, memories drifted back. The early days in Brooklyn, when he was just a teenager running with neighborhood friends. The first fights and the first moments when he realized he had a gift for leadership. The years spent climbing the ladder, surviving wars and betrayals. The rise to power after Joe Colombo's shooting, the trials, and the long sentences that followed. It was a story filled with victories but also losses that never left him. He thought about the men who had stood beside him, many of whom were long gone. He thought about rivals who had tried to end him, most of whom had failed. And he thought about the choices that had brought him here, choices that could never be undone. His reputation by then was something almost larger than life. Journalists and authors wrote about him, describing him as the last of the true old-school bosses, a man who had managed to hold power longer than anyone could have imagined. Some painted him as a mastermind, others as a relic, but all agreed his story was remarkable. Few could believe that someone could remain the official head of a crime family for decades, most of it while incarcerated. Yet that was exactly what Carmine Persico had done. His health worsened in the late 2010s. He required more frequent medical attention, and there were times when he was transferred to prison hospitals for treatment. His body, once strong and resilient, struggled under the weight of old age and the harshness of prison life. But even in those moments, he refused to let go of his role. He remained boss until the end, never stepping aside, never naming an official successor. It was his way of ensuring that his name would always be tied to the family he had led for so long. Among Mafia circles, there was quiet respect for this. Even rival families acknowledged the strength it took to maintain leadership under such circumstances. Younger mobsters, though they often lived in a world far removed from the one Carmine had known, saw in him an example of loyalty and stubborn endurance. They recognized that his story carried lessons about survival, about patience, and about the price of leadership. To law enforcement, Persico was a puzzle that had never been fully solved. They had convicted him, locked him away, and broken much of his organization, yet they could not erase his title. No matter how long he sat in prison, no matter how many years passed, he remained what he had been declared decades earlier, the boss of the Colombo family. It was both a victory and a frustration for prosecutors who saw in him a symbol of how deeply rooted the Mafia had once been. As his life drew closer to its final chapters, Persico was aware that he was outliving his era. The world he had once ruled had vanished. The five families still existed, but they no longer carried the same weight, no longer shaped the city in the same way. He had become part of history, a living reminder of a time when the Mafia's grip seemed unbreakable. His name was spoken with curiosity by younger generations who had never seen the days when the Mafia ruled the docks, the unions, and the streets. To them, Carmine Persico was a story, almost a legend. But to those who had lived it, he was very real, and his story was one that would never be forgotten. Even in frailty, he carried himself with dignity. Prison guards who had watched him for years noted his composure, the way he rarely showed fear or frustration. He accepted his circumstances with the calm of someone who had made peace with his life choices long ago. He was not a man to dwell on regret. He believed in the path he had taken, even if it had led him to a cell for the remainder of his days. That, perhaps, was the essence of Carmine Persico, unyielding, steadfast, and unwilling to let go of the power he had fought so hard to gain. In the quiet of his later years, as he faced the inevitable decline of health, he held on to what he valued most: his name, his family, and the respect that came from surviving longer than almost anyone else in his world. His story was nearing its end, but it was already one of the most remarkable sagas in Mafia history. For decades he had been a fighter, a survivor, and above all, a leader who never surrendered his position. When the story of Carmine Persico reached its conclusion, the man himself was gone, but his legend lingered. His death in 2019 had closed a book that had been written over more than 8 decades, yet people continued to turn the pages, fascinated by what his life represented. He was, to many, the last of a dying breed, one of the final links to a world that had once dominated the underworld of New York City. For younger generations, the name Persico may not have carried the same weight as Gotti, Capone, or Luciano. But for those who truly studied the history of organized crime, Carmine's story was unique. He had outlasted so many, defied odds that seemed insurmountable, and maintained his position until his last breath. That in itself was extraordinary. As the news of his passing spread, reflections began to pour in from all corners. Journalists revisited his rise from the Brooklyn streets to the boss of the Colombo family. Authors and documentary makers examined the wars he had fought, the betrayals he had endured, and the unusual length of his reign. Historians pointed out how rare it was for any mafia boss to hold on to power so long, especially from within a prison cell. Even law enforcement officials who had pursued him over the years admitted that Persico was different. He was not reckless, not flamboyant, but calculating and persistent. That patience had allowed him to survive while flashier men had burned out quickly. For his family, though, the legacy was personal. They remembered him not just as a boss, but as a father, grandfather, and relative. They thought of the small moments shared during visits, the advice he gave, the pride he showed in their accomplishments. To them, he was not simply the snake that newspapers wrote about, but a man who cared for them in his own way, even if his choices had placed a heavy burden on their lives. At his funeral, there were tears not for a crime boss, but for a patriarch who had been taken by time and illness. It was a reminder that behind every public figure lies a private life filled with love, regret, and connection. In the wider Mafia world, his death was like the closing of a chapter. By 2019, the Mafia was no longer the empire it once had been. Its influence had waned, its ranks had thinned, and its leaders no longer commanded the same power over unions, businesses, and politicians. Yet Carmine Persico's story carried with it echoes of the past. He belonged to the generation that had lived through the golden years, when the 5 families were at their strongest. His journey stretched from the neighborhood streets of the 1940s to the cell blocks of the 21st century, a timeline that mirrored the rise and decline of the American Mafia itself. For many, what stood out most about Carmine was his endurance. He was sentenced to life in prison at a relatively young age, yet he did not fade into obscurity as so many others did. Instead, he remained relevant. His name still mentioned in conversations about Mafia leadership, his influence still felt in the structure of his family. Even when rivals tried to seize control, his position as boss was rarely questioned. To hold on to power from behind bars for more than 3 decades was unheard of, and it cemented his reputation as one of the most resilient figures in the underworld. But endurance came with a cost. Carmine had spent more than half of his life locked away. He missed holidays, milestones, and the simple pleasures of everyday life. He did not see the streets of Brooklyn change, the skyline of New York evolve, or the world outside shift into new eras. His prison years were long, repetitive, and isolating. Yet even in that isolation, he refused to let go of the identity he had built. In his mind, he remained the boss, the man who had fought his way to the top and held on to it no matter the circumstances. That refusal to yield became both his burden and his pride. As time passed after his death, Carmine's story began to take on the shape of legend. Writers described him as a man of contradictions, ruthless yet loyal, cunning yet patient, enduring yet trapped. Documentaries spoke of his role in Mafia wars, his leadership during chaotic times, and his ability to control his family even while behind bars. His name appeared alongside those of other infamous bosses, but always with a note of difference. Where others fell quickly, Carmine had remained, and that made him unique. In neighborhoods where stories of the old days still passed between generations, his name lived on as part of the oral history. Old-timers remembered him as a